welcome to Hamilton, the podcast. I'm Vinton Bain.
And I am Robbie Herlocker, and this is another one of the not exactly accurately named 10-minute histories.
Yes, probably a little bit longer. We're going to be talking about a little Christmas vacation that Robbie had where he got to see Mount Vernon. But before that, you have some kind of Hamilton news, I heard.
That's right. So I haven't actually told you this. I don't know whether you heard this or not, but...
Probably not. I'm out of the loop.
Have you heard the news about who is going to be Aaron Burr, sir, in Chicago?
No.
Wayne Brady.
What? Yeah.
Yes.
I guess I can. Yeah. All right.
Wayne Brady is going to be Aaron Burr.
I really kind of want to see it in Chicago now.
Yes, I know.
I like Wayne Brady a lot.
He's so good and he's so talented.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Isn't that exciting? I didn't want to tell you right beforehand because I thought it'd be nice to hear your surprise on mic.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I definitely want tickets to Chicago now. So as you mentioned, I did just get to spend a good amount of time visiting Virginia and Washington, D.C. and seeing some friends out there and seeing some my girlfriend Liz, her family is out there in Virginia. Yeah. And so we got to spend some time with her family for Christmas. But then between the holidays, I got to spend a good amount of time at places like Mount Vernon. I also saw a few of the Smithsonian museums, one of the Air and Space museums. I saw the Natural History Museum, the Museum of American History. That was fun. Up front and center, they had one of the pairs of Judy Garland's ruby slippers.
Oh, that's amazing.
Which seemed about appropriate, greeting me as an old Kansas native, Kansas boy.
And now you are in the wonderful land of Oz.
I felt like it for sure. I was over the rainbow. I got to see one of the walking sticks that Benjamin Franklin used when he got gouged in the leg. That was kind of neat. At the American History Museum, they also had one of those medallions that Thomas Jefferson bribed native chieftains with when he was trying to steal their land. They put it in a much more PC description on the plaque. They said something about how Jefferson had these wonderful agreements he struck with the native tribes and the indigenous peoples, and he often, as a sign of good faith about the agreement they had just made, he would give them this token of faith, which happened to have his face on it. It was just kind of a like, Jefferson medal or something, but it was neat to see that. There were a lot of things that were just fascinating.
Yeah. I got to go up to that area when I was a lot younger, and I got to see some of the museums and the monuments and things of that sort. And I remember not being as interested in the American history then because I was a young boy, and most young boys are not. I was, like most young boys, interested in the dinosaurs.
Exactly.
I was like, look at those dinosaurs.
Well, the 2-year-old was with us, and she was much more interested in like they had a huge hanging whale when we walked into the Natural History Museum. Yeah. It was a lot of fun.
Giant dinosaurs or giant bones of any sort.
We did see
whales, dinosaurs, all sorts.
We walked in and I saw a skeleton of an alligator, and I said, "Oh, that's an alligator skeleton." And she said, "Oh no, what happened?" I was like, "Well, he lived a long, happy life and then died peacefully in his sleep. And several hundred years later."
Yep. Absolutely nothing attacked and killed him.
Yes, of course not. And it definitely wasn't humans. We'll just leave it at that. But I also got to see a number of the monuments, just kind of drive-by tour of those. I made it to the National Archives, so I got to see the Declaration of Independence, and I got to see the Constitution, and oh man, there's so much good stuff there. Also, John Adams had a heavy hand. His penmanship, like I could find his signature on all these faded documents pretty easily. It was fun to see that. It was fun to see Alexander Hamilton's signature on the Constitution, and you get to see a lot of amazing things there. In a lot of the places we visited, they don't allow photography, and so it would have been really nice if we could have taken pictures there. Would have loved to go all Nicolas Cage on the Declaration of Independence and just take it and run away with it and have some fun. It would have been exciting to do that, but unfortunately, I do have standards, and I would not stoop to that level, and I respect our founding documents, and but it was so much fun to be there and be able to actually look at these documents that we've been discussing, we've been reading, we've been studying in depth. It was so exciting. And after the election and our discussions about the Electoral College and the Hamilton electors and all of this, they had an exhibit there about how the Electoral College was supposed to work according to the founders and how it all happened. And they had a number of exhibits that were designed to show you what if we had gone with all these other different ideas for how to elect president. And there was one just randomizer where it was just a lottery ticket where you just spin the thing, and it would just be a lottery. Wow. And I think that Janet Jackson was the president when I selected it. It was like, if I spun the wheel, then Janet Jackson would be the president of the United States.
All right. Yeah, I was going to say it might not end so well, but that wouldn't be too bad.
I could live with it. I could live with it.
So you actually brought me a gift from Mount Vernon. George Washington had a distillery, and he made his own whiskey, and they rebuilt this distillery the way it was built back then, and just not too long ago started making whiskey in there using his recipes.
That's right. So Washington was one of the premier whiskey makers of his day, and he got a lot of money from making whiskey in his distillery. And this particular recipe was discovered by researchers who examined Washington's distillery ledgers during the time of 1798 to 1799, and they kind of looked at it and dissected how he made it, what he did. And it would be 60% rye, 35% corn, and 5% malted barley for his whiskey. And at the time, the custom was to sell the whiskey in a clear form.
Yeah, and that's what we have here. It's very clear.
It's not what I expected whenever I looked at it until I read the description and started studying it and looking at that. This is twice distilled, and it's sold in an unaged, colorless form. It's kind of exciting to know that this is what he might have been drinking.
Yeah. We're going to try this whiskey here on air.
That's right.
That comes in these little fancy shot glasses that say, it has George Washington's signature, and it says, George Washington's Distillery. To Lin-Manuel Miranda and the magic that he has brought our lives.
Oh, that is good.
That is good.
Wow. It's smoother than I imagined.
Yeah, definitely so. So if you have the chance to visit Mount Vernon, pick up some whiskey. For sure.
Yeah, it's so good. I love
Hamilton
this.
Podcast seal of approval. Not that it needs it, probably.
I did get ID'd.
Oh, well, that's good. Washington probably wouldn't approve of that.
Given it to minors. I don't know if there was a drinking age at the time.
No, that's what I was saying. I don't think there was a drinking age.
Right. He probably. Oh, you're right. Yeah, he wouldn't have.
Like, just give him the alcohol. We're having a fun time here.
I've seen guys younger than that take up the gun and defend their country. So. By my age, he had already led his men straight into a massacre and witnessed their deaths firsthand.
Yep. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we are talking about the estate of George Washington, Mount Vernon.
That's right.
Robbie got to see, and I got to see a little bit, because if you go to Mount Vernon's website, which we'll put a link to the show notes, you can take a full tour visually on your computer or your cell phone or your tablet with tons of clicking information points. They have videos and stories, and you can get full 360-degree views of all the different rooms, even rooms that you're not allowed into on the tour.
Right. They have certain rooms that are roped off, and you can just kind of lean in and kind of get an angle and try to see what you can see. But there on the virtual tour, you're able to go in, walk around. It feels like Skyrim, because a number of the places, especially like the distillery, looks like you're walking into an old distillery, because that's what it's restored to look like, colonial times. But then, like the slave quarters, you can go into all these different areas and just walk in there, and it's 360 views. It's not just a flat picture of these rooms. It's fascinating.
You can go up into the Lafayette bedroom and just hang out in there and pretend like you're Lafayette.
That's true. Apparently, Lafayette stayed in that particular guest room, they think, and a lot of guests stayed there. But can you imagine waking up in a 4-poster bed, and then at the foot of the bed is a huge portrait of yourself?
Yep, there's a giant Lafayette at the foot of that bed.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's go ahead and dive into our 10-minute history, starting the clock now to see how far we miss the 10-minute mark.
Right. So, first things first, Robbie. This land that everything's built on, beautiful piece of land right by the river.
Oh, yes.
How did George Washington come by this land?
Well, our story begins with one Mr. John Washington, who was banned from attending Oxford University, all because his father chose to fight on the wrong side of the English Civil War.
As one does.
That's right. This great-great-grandfather of George Washington was a British royalist who defended the throne against these rabble-rousers, the parliamentarians. But as much as that may make you want to cue up a specific Alanis Morissette song, we don't really have time to dwell on that irony. What matters right now is that John Washington, George's great-grandfather, was not allowed to attend the university, so he apprenticed himself to a merchant. And eventually, said John would serve as the second officer on a merchant ship transporting tobacco to England from this little colony known as Virginia. When the merchant ship bottomed out on the Potomac River in 1657, John Washington decided to stay in Virginia and make his home there.
That's fascinating. So where does our story go from there?
Well, fast forwarding past a little love story and a lot of tobacco planting slaves, John Washington purchased a farm on the same Potomac River in 1674. Originally named the Little Hunting Creek, the property was handed down to George Washington's older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, who renamed it after his commanding officer, the Vice Admiral in the British Navy, Edward Vernon, thus was christened Mount Vernon. That's the name that George Washington kept after leasing the property in 1754 and becoming the sole owner of the property in either 1761 or 62. I saw different numbers.
So looking at this mansion that they have built on this land, it's very huge. And from what I understand, it was even really large for its time. Is this something that he came into inheritance of from his descendants?
Well, yes and no. So George's dad, Augustine Washington, built a modest little 1.5-story farmhouse on the mansion site in 1735. But George himself is responsible for literally raising the roof to be 2.5 stories tall. And he added the north and south wings that are famous. And the famous large columned porch is his touch. And other little bitty special features he was really involved in making there too. In all, the mansion is 11,028 square feet, and it is about 10 times the average size of a colonial home of his day.
Wow, that is pretty big. So you mentioned that there's these special little features that Washington included. What are some of those?
Well, for starters, there are certain little features like how some of the wood is designed to look like stone, but he just took like sanding to it and took some sand attached to it and then painted it in a certain ways that it looked textured like stone around some of the windows. That's kind of neat, I thought. Also, symmetry was really, really popular in that day, and Washington really valued it. But because of the way the house was built in segments, and he raised the roof a little bit, added a wing here, added a wing there, he wasn't able to have perfect symmetry. So there's a literal fake window that he added so that the windows would line up, and he would make it look like it's a little more symmetrical. If you look at the house, you can see that the door's not exactly in the middle, which always kind of bothered him slightly, but he tried to make it as symmetrical as he could. And there are a lot of things just like that, where Washington was just intimately connected with the designing and the planning for the expansion of this mansion house, from little plastic pieces to add texture around the doorways or on the ceiling, to commissioning a specific weather vane with a bird of peace, a dove with an olive branch in his mouth, flying at the very rooftop of the house. He picked the art inside of this house specifically with a lot of water themes, a lot of Greek motifs, and a number of things inside of this house were just absolutely picked by him, and the color schemes, and it's fascinating to see how intimately he was involved in designing this, his own plantation.
So we don't have time to go through everything that the tour takes you through into the mansion.
I wish we did. That's true.
But why don't you talk us through a couple of the rooms at least?
Right. So when you're going through the mansion, you're not allowed to take any pictures, which is very sad. I would have loved to take a selfie with George Washington.
Right. We could maybe Photoshop that in on that virtual tour they give.
Right. Of course. We can figure that out. So on the tour, you enter through the side room instead of through the front door, just because of the way the traffic works and trying to preserve certain things. The flow of traffic through the house, it works better if you enter through the side. And so they take you in through the side. But if we were to enter through the front room, what we would see is that that's where George Washington's butler slave would have met people. And the tour guide explained to us that if your name was something like Madison or Jefferson or Monroe, you'd probably get a seat at the general's table that evening for dinner, and you'd be put up in one of the special guest rooms. And if your name wasn't something special, or the butler didn't recognize you as someone worthy of dining with the general and his wife, then you would just be put up in one of the lesser guest rooms, which still looked fancy, still looked great. And you would go in there and you'd probably get a small meal for yourself so that they didn't act like they were unhospitable and turn people away. Washington wanted people to visit his house and to come in and visit him because even in his day, it was popular to visit George Washington's home. And he wanted people to see it. He wanted it to be accessible. And that's one of the legacies that's continued to today, which is really important, I think.
Right. I wonder if they ever had any problems with somebody just showing up day after day. They were kind of poor. They lived in a shabby shack and didn't have great meals, but they were like, if I can just go to Washington's house, he gives me a nice room and meal. It's great. Sometimes I even get to see him on the property and wave at him. And they're like, Fred, come on. This is your 5th night in a row. Go home.
Go home. I don't believe that would have necessarily happened because of a few things. One, they did have a standard policy of turning people out the next morning, kind of putting them on their way. But then also, he owned a whole bunch of land around there. So you didn't accidentally wander onto the property. You would have had to intentionally land up there. And then it also would have been a long journey to get there from the next closest house.
Well, there could have been Washington fanboys even in that day.
Oh, I'm sure. Absolutely. In that same front room, you would see hanging on the wall, one of the things that caught my eye is the key to the Bastille in Paris, given to George Washington by none other than the Marquis de Lafayette. So this is a momentum from when they stormed in 1789. They stormed the Bastille to start the French Revolution. And as a National Guard leader, Marquis de Lafayette gave Washington the key to the Bastille to symbolize all of that. And it was just, it's fascinating to see that and to see that connection, to know that this is something that was given by by America's favorite fighting Frenchman to America's venerated Virginian veteran. It's just so interesting there to make that other connection. Another thing I noticed when I went through a lot of the house was there are a lot of kind of forest greens throughout there. Yeah. And Washington apparently was very fond of painting in that color. But Mrs. Washington decorated the master bedroom. So it lacks all of the greens that you would see in the rest of the house. And I almost wonder whether she had any words with him about how she thought colors on the walls should have been. But I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in that conversation. Most of the bedrooms have the fireplace in them to warm it. There were some what they call
central heat in there then.
Exactly. And so they had what's called Franklin fireplaces, which are kind of self-standing fireplaces in some of the rooms. Most of the rooms have their own actual master fireplace, which was fun. They all had those little bed warmers for you to collect some hot coals and put it under your mattress to warm up the bed at night. And so it was really neat to kind of get into the idea of what it would have been like to stay there and imagine that. One of the things the tour guide pointed out to me is how the narrow stairway outside of Washington's bedchamber is about 5'8" in height. And the general himself was over 6 foot. He was 6'2", I think. And so he would have had to stoop every single time he walked down those stairs.
I feel that.
You're a very tall man.
6'3", I feel your pain, Washington.
Absolutely. Another room that I could have just spent days in if I was visiting General Washington back then and he let me into this part of his house is what they call the general's quarters. It's his place where he would get ready several mornings. He had all of his books on the walls. He had his desk there. The windows overlooked the Potomac River, and it was just gorgeous. And all the books that were actually in his shelves are now in some vault somewhere, but they had facsimiles in a lot of the places. You can kind of see a lot of the books. They did that with a lot of the items in Mount Vernon where they have facsimiles there, but the actual item is in a museum somewhere.
Yeah, they want to take care of that for sure.
Right. So there's a picture on the wall in the general's quarters there in his study of Lawrence Washington, his big brother on the wall. He was the one that who was supposed to inherit Mount Vernon instead of George Washington. If he had lived longer, Washington would never have owned Mount Vernon, probably. Definitely interesting there. Lawrence was well read. He was someone that definitely was looked up to by General Washington. What I thought was neat, because it took me a second to figure out what it was, and then the tour guide actually explained it to me, was at the general's desk, there's this tall chair that has a sign hanging down from a little overhanging thing that kind of loops up and it's over the top of your head, and it has a fan that goes underneath it. And what it's tied to is a pedal underneath the chair where you can start pedaling with your feet, or not pedaling, but like pumping back and forth on it. And then it would send the fan blade back and forth across your head. So you could fan yourself while you're working out a little bit while you're writing letters at your desk. So he would get his exercise in the morning, get cooled down a little bit, and get his business done.
Did you immediately get on Amazon to see if those are still available somewhere?
I didn't want them to think I was taking pictures, so I kept my phone in my pocket.
We'll have to check later.
You should. One other thing I found interesting about the way they restored this house is that obviously George Washington lived there for quite a while.
Right.
And Martha Washington lived there even longer. And this house went through several stages of hosting people, housing people. And so they could have restored it to several different stages of the house's life cycle. They picked how the house would have looked on the week that George Washington died. So you see that the tables are moved out of the main dining room and are in the larger guest room where they could host more people around the dining table. And the slaves would have carried it in there and set the places for a larger group there. And you got to see how the bed was set up when George Washington actually died on his deathbed. They told us about how Martha Washington would have, according to the tradition of widows at the time, she would have closed up that room and she took a separate room in the house. She moved upstairs. Martha Washington moved upstairs, and she, unlike many other widows, never moved back into the bedchambers. I don't know if she couldn't take living in the room where her husband had died, or if she just got comfortable living on the top floor in her smaller Martha's bedchamber there or not. But it's interesting to see just the stories behind that house. And so many stories happened and were told inside of those walls. And I would have loved to just go back in time and just witness one dinner party at this house. It would have been awesome to see.
Yeah, for sure. So that's what's inside the house. But taking that virtual tour, there's a lot outside the house.
That's right. George Washington's Mount Vernon totaled somewhere around 8,000 acres at its largest size.
Yeah.
And it was divided into multiple different farms where you'd have a whole self-contained unit of slaves and their own foreman on one property, and you'd have to take a horse and ride several miles to see the next farm. And one of the things I thought was interesting is that only 500 acres are presently contained on this historic property that have been preserved. And so a lot of houses that are actually just owned by normal people, well, I guess rich people, but normal people live in these houses on property that would have been owned by George Washington.
Yeah, interesting.
So the actual grounds that he owned went much farther than the bounds of what is visited today as Mount Vernon's estate. That's just the mansion farm that you see now.
Right, and it's large enough. Looking at that virtual tour, you get to see that there's so much on that property. You have the distillery, the farmhouses, the
gardens,
slaves' quarters, gardens, the
wharf,
the tombs.
Yeah.
All sorts of different things. And then there's, of course, just yards, fields the size of my neighborhood.
Yes, that's true. So much. It's incredible. They actually had some livestock there, live livestock, which is kind of neat to see on a farm, kind of to see what it would have been like to actually see animals there. And there weren't a lot, but it was neat to see some sheep, and I think there was an ox as well somewhere. It was kind of neat. We went down by where the water was, and we couldn't go out on the dock because they had it roped off for the day. I may or may not have had an against the rules picnic there. I will not own up to that if you contact the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and tell them about that. But it was a nice place to be. I could imagine just spending a lot of times there. The gardens were lovely already, and it was winter when I visited. So I would love to see it in the spring. I would love to see what happens there. The view of the Potomac River. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Sitting there on the porch, looking out at the waters, walking towards the water. Wow. It was incredible. It was just awesome to see this. George Washington got a lot of money also. In addition to tobacco, in addition to distilling whiskey, he also had a lot of fishing there on the Potomac River. And so you could just imagine people down there casting nets and fishing on the side of the river. It was just so interesting to see that particular side of things, just being there. There's a large forested area you can walk through. I didn't need to go through everything, but it made me start thinking about how awesome it'd be to just camp out on his property and to spend time there. I'm sure it's illegal. I don't know what kind of fine there is, but I don't know how much would you pay to be able to say I slept on George Washington's land.
Cool. I'd pay a lot more to sleep in the house, probably.
Oh yes, absolutely. I would never be willing to risk that.
They would never allow that.
That would never. I will never be important enough to even ask someone to do that. So yes, you mentioned the tomb, the most somber part of the entire tour. You go down there and you see where a number of the Washington family are buried, and obviously Martha and George have their own marble caskets, and you see the vault behind them where a lot of the Washington family lays, and where their kept. Their remains are kept. And apparently the marble caskets were supposed to go back inside of that vault itself, but the stonemaker made them a little bit too large, so they couldn't go in there. So they built this larger shrine around it, which works out well because it's lovely and it's beautiful there. It was somber to see it, but at least an equally sober part of the tour for me was looking at slave quarters and some of the properties and burial areas of slaves.
Yeah, that was something I noticed when I was doing the virtual tour, is they do have a memorial to the slave burial grounds. But the slave burial grounds are just these gigantic pits, basically. There's no individually marked graves, of course. They just buried them all in the same area, unnamed, unmarked. And so they did eventually put up a marker in the 1920s, the association that runs the estate. And so there is something there to let you know, hey, this is where the slaves on the land were buried. And then they've built like a nice little memorial around there. And they do archaeological digs around the remains. And if they find the remains, they like to keep them where they are for respect. But they do the digs around them so they can learn like how many were buried there, who was buried where, and find out some more historical facts, since they were just basically put into this big group communal grave.
Right. There's a museum on the Mount Vernon estate now where you can see as part of most of it is dedicated to George Washington's life, but there's a segment of it, an exhibit dedicated directly to the slaves of Mount Vernon. And you see a lot of their names, this listed by name. Most of them are just given a first name, and you see them. There's this large wall of glass before you walk into the exhibit doors, and you're just seeing the names. Like I'm making up names off the top of my head, but to see them going down like John, Mary, Jane, and see all these names that actually represent real people,
right,
who were treated as property there.
It's just crazy too to think that there were so many slaves that in the grave that I saw that said there was 150 people buried there. 150 slaves buried.
Yeah, 150 human beings
that have worked for you. And it's just it really drives home when you see things like that, the shame of American history there, that particular part of American history.
It does.
And what drove it home even further for me is, like we mentioned, the slave quarters and seeing the type of living situation that these people would live in, where there was these little shacks that even historical documents, they were saying people that would see them would call them shabby and say that they were not built well. It said that a visitor to Washington's estate toward the very end of the 1700s said that the living quarters there for the slaves were wretched.
Right. You pointed out how a couple of the floors were just total dirt floors.
Yeah, total dirt floors.
And even his stables had wood floors.
Right. Yeah. So the animals have floors built into the buildings, but the slaves do not get floors. And it's crazy. Looking at the little shack, I'm just thinking this is maybe the size of my bedroom. Maybe. And I don't have a very big bedroom, but it's got a small fireplace, a place to hang your coats, one bed looking thing down there, and then it has a loft area on top. And it said that around 10 slaves would live in one of these. And I'm just like,
wow.
In what space?
Yeah.
There's no floor space left just from people sleeping. And then, of course, there were other quarters. They said there was duplex-like ones where larger families would live, which was like 2. And then there were the men's living quarters, I'm assuming for the single men who didn't have families. And these were just looked like military bunks type of thing. And they had beds there, but it was just hay with a sheet thrown on top.
Mm-hmm. If you remember watching the Hamilton documentary on PBS, you saw Chris Jackson, who plays George Washington on Broadway, sitting inside of one of these slave quarters. And he's a black man. And he's wrestling out loud with the fact that George Washington was an incredible man. And he had this incredible sin.
Yeah.
We talk about how George Washington is the only founding father who freed his slaves in his will. His last will and testament, he freed his slaves upon the death of Martha. And apparently Martha released them a little bit earlier because it's a little inconvenient living in the household with a bunch of people who have a vested interest in your death.
Right.
So she freed them a little bit early. Sadly, less than half of the slaves on Washington's plantation were actually open to that invitation, because a little over half were owned by the Custis estate, and Washington didn't have the right to free them. They went to the heirs of the Custis family, and that's who Washington married into, his wife and his stepchildren.
Yeah, it's really sad when you look at the contrast of things too, where you see the shabby shacks that the slaves would live in, and then you would see the house that those slaves probably built, or some other slaves probably built and put together. They could build these nice things, but they weren't allowed to build nicer things for themselves. That's not where their time was supposed to be taken. And I read a small article, and I won't go too far into this, about how often the families would live separated because the man would be assigned to one part of the farm and the woman to another, and they had to live on their own parts assigned. But it was on Sundays, I believe, Saturday nights, they would get to walk out toward each other and see each other for the night and for the next day, I guess, a little bit of the time. And apparently, Washington even complained about that, saying that it hurt productivity because they would be tired from their long walks to see their spouse.
Yeah, there are too many painful stories about Washington and his slaves.
Yeah, just those contrasts of that type of living. It's so hard to imagine in our current day. Like we mentioned earlier, all you had to do was walk up to the house and say, "Oh, I'm so and so," and then, "Oh, you're not important enough to get to sit at Washington's table, but here, have a room, have a meal." Not if your skin's not the right color, though.
Yeah, that's America's original sin: racism and slavery.
Yeah,
unacceptable. The museum itself works really hard to show George Washington's evolving views of slavery and how he, by the end of his life, thought it was an abomination and a sin, and it's why he put it into his will. People argue this back and forth. Some historians emphasize his harsh treatment of his slaves. Some historians emphasize his greatness and how he evolved to hate slavery. We won't be able to solve that here, but we hope that we will be able to have a George Washington focused episode very soon where we go into more of his life and his story. Getting into that would be really exciting. So I won't, because of that, go into everything that's in the George Washington Museum that's on the property there at Mount Vernon, because what they do is they go through his whole life, his family, his education, his early job as a surveyor, his involvement in almost like provoking the French and Indian War. You see him going through his involvement with the Freemasons, running for political office, getting married, working for a church, and getting involved in the Revolutionary War. You see him going through his presidency. You talk about his life as a businessman, as a slave owner, and then it kind of culminates with his presidency and him talking about the Whiskey Rebellion and the Jay's Treaty. And I thought this was interesting. You might get a kick out of this pun. When talking about the exhibit displaying Washington's first cabinet, it is a literal cabinet. it has like not drawers but little shelves you open up or little doors you open on it, and it says like, who was George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury? You open the door on the cabinet and it says Alexander Hamilton. Same goes for his Secretary of War and State and his Attorney General. Two final things I'll comment on from the museum. First is at the very end of it, it's got this chilling story where you read about his final hours. Washington's final hours of thinking he caught a cold and then going out and working anyways. And he's like, I never take anything for a cold, let it come, let it go as it came. And then talking about how he overdid it and then how he spent the next couple of days writhing in pain. And then he got bled, and it's awful. It's terrible. All from a disease that is easily cured today.
Right.
And so that's a somber, chilling moment when you read through that. Another more lighthearted exhibit is where I got to see George Washington's dentures. It's kind of gross to look at that, but you see, looking around, there's a timeline of his teeth themselves, and you can see how they're put in there. And we've talked on this podcast before about how he's fabled as having all wooden teeth, but really he had teeth made out of ivory and some actual human teeth, potentially from some of his slaves or from other things.
Don't know if we want to think about the implications of that like we didn't want to the first time.
That's painful. But you also got to see the spring on the back of the dentures is really kind of thick. And Washington would have had to bite down pretty hard in order to keep those dentures together and the false teeth closed. So it's almost like you can imagine him in his older age getting more of a stiff jaw and a clenched jaw. And it would be interesting to see how that affects his composure and the way he stands and the way he speaks even and articulates his words. But all that to be said, Mount Vernon was a magical place. It was a wonderful visit, had beauty next to horrible memories, next to incredible innovations and wonderful ideas. And it's incredible how much of this place has been preserved as a monument to America's premier founding father, George Washington. And a lot of that credit goes to the association that received this property from the Washington family and has preserved it since that day. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association, who works nonstop to make sure people like myself can go visit this, and people who are all over the world can visit this through the power of the internet and these virtual tours we mentioned, so that we can see what it was like to walk in the places where George Washington would have walked, where Thomas Jefferson would have visited to see George Washington. It's fascinating to see what happened in this location.
And if you would like to take that virtual tour or find out more information about Mount Vernon, go to mountvernon.org. We'll have a link to that in the show notes.
So as promised, we did not make this into a 10-minute history. We don't necessarily expect any of them to really be 10 minutes.
It might be that we need to stop calling them 10-minute histories.
Yeah, but I mean, then we have to change, then it's noticeable that we missed it.
Good point. Let's keep calling them 10-minute histories and keep missing them.
Keep missing it every single time.
It's going to become a new trend.
It's a half-hour history. Actually, half-hour history is get the alliteration of the H's or the assonance. We should have gone that route anyways.
Well, decisions were made and they weren't the right ones.
Can you remember? We thought that 10 minutes would make it easier on ourselves. Yeah. And now we cannot even hit that.
At least to give us a goal to reach. Maybe it'd be a lot worse if they were half-hour histories.
Right. We would be on and on and on and on for days.
That being said, thank you for returning to Hamilton the Podcast. We'll be coming back to you in a couple of weeks to talk more about the Hamilton mixtape. Remember, hit us up on Twitter and let us know what your favorite song on the mixtape is. That's at Graphocast, GRAPHOCAST. Check out the website, graphocast.com, or like our page on Facebook.
Speaking of Twitter, if you go to at Mount Vernon, it's the official Twitter feed for George Washington's Mount Vernon, the home of our first president for mountvernon.org. And it's fascinating, some of the facts they put on there about just George Washington's life, his history. I actually started following them after my visit to Mount Vernon, and it's just interesting, the things they will tweet and the involvement you can get with it. So check them out. Let them know how much you love their site and you appreciate it. And if you want to tell either of us about your fondness for Mount Vernon yourself, you can hit me up personally at Alpha Knight.
And I'm at Fleshy there. We'd love to hear it, especially if you have had a chance to go see Mount Vernon. And if Twitter is not your thing, you can always email us, contact@graphocast.com. We'd like to say a quick thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. If you'd like to support the Graphomania Podcast Network and shows like this, go to patreon.com/Graphocast. That's patreon.com/GRAPHOCAST. Kick us $1 or more a month and get special goodies or secret shows. Until next time, I'm Vinton Bain.
And I am Robbie Herlocker.
Cheers. This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com. Follow us on Twitter at Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.